It sounds kind of weird, but what if I told you that your body is constantly strategically shrinking parts of itself just to survive? It's a process called atrophy, and it's one of the most fundamental ways our bodies deal with the world. And today, we're going to dive in and break down exactly how this whole thing works. So, let me start by asking you something. What could a broken arm stuck in a cast possibly have in common with just getting older? I mean, at first glance, you'd think they have nothing to do with each other, right? But they are absolutely connected by a really powerful biological principle. And the answer? Well, it's deep inside our cells.
Right, so that's where the answer to our little puzzle is hiding. See, before we can even get into why things shrink, you've got to understand just how amazing our cells are at adapting. They are constantly making these little adjustments to keep us alive and kicking.
Okay, so picture this. Every single one of your cells, and you have trillions of them, has this little survival toolkit. That's basically what cellular adaptation is. So when a cell gets stressed out, maybe its workload changes or the environment gets weird, it doesn't just give up. Nope. It digs into that toolkit and figures out how to adjust and keep things chugging along. But here's the thing. That toolkit isn't infinite. There's a limit. If the stress is just too much or it goes on for way too long, the cell gets overwhelmed. And that's when you get cell injury. And if things still don't get better, that injury can become permanent and, well, the cell dies. It's this constant high-stakes balancing act, survival versus damage. All right, so where does atrophy fit into all of this? You might think it's a sign of failure, but it's not at all. Actually, it's one of the smartest tools in that cellular toolkit we talked about. Think of it like a strategic retreat. So let's get into what that really means. At its core, atrophy is just strategic shrinking. That's it. The city analogy is perfect here. If a city is running low on resources, what does it do? It shuts down stuff it doesn't absolutely need, right? To save power, save water. That is exactly what a cell does. It shrinks, cuts back on its energy needs, and just tries to wait out the tough times. It's pure survival mode. Now, this is super important to get. Not all atrophy is bad. On one hand, you've got physiologic atrophy. This is the totally normal, healthy kind. A perfect example is the uterus shrinking back down after childbirth. That's just part of the body's natural plan. But then on the other hand, you have pathologic atrophy. This is the kind that happens because of disease or an injury. And yep, this is where our broken arm fits right in. It's atrophy that's telling us something's wrong. So you might be wondering, what's actually happening inside the cell? Like, what's the switch that gets flipped to tell it to shrink? Well, it all comes down to this really elegant balancing act. Literally, a cell's entire life is this constant balance. On one side, you have the cell building stuff, making new proteins. On the other side, you have the cell breaking down old stuff, getting rid of old proteins. In a happy, healthy cell, those two things are perfectly balanced. So what happens when some kind of stressor shows up? Well, first, all the internal signals inside the cell get thrown off. And bam, that immediately tips the scales. The breakdown process kicks into high gear. It's like the cell's recycling system goes into overdrive. At the same time, the building process slows way down. So now the scale is totally tilted towards breaking things down, not building them up. And the end result? A smaller, leaner cell that's just trying to save energy. Okay, so we get the how. Now let's talk about the why. What are the actual real-world things that can trigger this kind of pathologic atrophy? So here are the usual suspects. You've got disuse. The phrase use it or lose it is literally describing this. Then you have things like poor nutrition, nerve damage, a loss of hormonal signals, even just being under constant pressure. And a really big one is something called ischemia, which is just a fancy word for not getting enough blood flow. That starves the cells of oxygen and all the good stuff they need. Any of these can kickstart that shrinking process. And hey, this brings us right back to our question from the beginning, the broken arm. A limb stuck in a cast? That is the textbook example of disuse atrophy. The muscle cells just aren't doing anything, so the body basically says, all right, we don't need you at full power right now. Let's power down. So the cells shrink. But the cool part is, it's reversible. The second that cast comes off and you start using the muscle again, it sends a signal back to the cells saying, okay, party's back on, time to grow. Let's talk about another huge one, that lack of blood supply, ischemia. Think about it like a factory supply chain. If the factory stops getting deliveries of raw materials, it can't keep producing at full steam, right? It has to scale back. It's the same thing with our cells. If brain cells, for example, aren't getting enough oxygen because the arteries are clogged, they have no choice but to shrink down to lower their energy needs. It really is a desperate survival tactic. And then there's the nerve connection.
Our nerves are like a constant hotline to our muscles, sending messages that say, hey, stay strong, stay ready. But what happens if that line gets cut? Maybe from an injury that causes paralysis. Suddenly, the muscle cells get radio silence. They've lost their instructions. Without those stay active orders coming in, they start to atrophy. It's a powerful reminder of how interconnected everything is inside our bodies. Okay, so we know the what and the why, but what's the so what? What are the real consequences? Why should we even care about all this? This, right here, is the bottom line. When enough cells in an organ shrink, the entire organ starts to fail. It just can't do its job anymore. We're not just talking about something getting smaller. We're talking about a loss of function that can have huge consequences for our health. And this chart really lays it all out. Take a look. The first example, disuse of a skeletal muscle leads to weakness. That's our arm in a cast. Simple enough. But now look at the second one, ischemia, that poor blood flow happening in the brain. The consequence there? It can mess with your memory, your thinking. It's wild, right? The exact same cellular process, just happening in different places, can lead to completely different problems. And that really brings us to a pretty mind-bending final thought. We like to think our bodies are these stable, unchanging things, but they're not. The truth is, they're in a constant state of change. Right now, as you're listening to this, your cells are adapting. They're shrinking, they're growing, all based on what you're doing. So it kind of makes you wonder, doesn't it? In a body that's built for constant change, what does normal really even mean?